Welcome to the Red Rose Film Club, a movie podcast that examines the wide world of cinema through a perpetually lefty pinko commie soy boy cuck Antifa super soldier filter. But more specifically, we love movies and want to create a podcast that would appeal to the disparate tastes of our liberal, leftist, socialist, communist, Marxist, and Leninist friends. Red Rose Film Club is for leftists of all stripes who don't know what to talk about at parties other than movies and politics. My name is Craig. I work in public education and am passionate about social justice and workers' rights. My tastes range, but mostly exist on opposite ends of the highbrow, lowbrow spectrum. And I'm with...
Hey, I'm Hal. I use she/they pronouns. I work in higher ed and I run a food pantry. I care about food access, reproductive justice, building a robust social welfare state, and ending the state's domination through the criminal legal system. I'm partial to movies about the Vietnam War, and unlike everybody who called Apocalypse Now Redux cut bloated and slow, I love it. So, Craig.
Yes?
What other pop culture are you getting into these days?
I went to the movies a couple times for the first time in forever.
Nice.
I saw... Dungeons & Dragons movie.
What did you think about that?
I thought it was like hella fun. I'm a Dungeons & Dragons player, so like I enjoyed it for that reason. I don't love when like movies are kind of patronizing to fans in that way, but I didn't feel like this one was. I was ready for a lot of like Marvel style like winking to fans and that kind of annoying stuff, but I thought it was pretty good.
Nice. I have not seen it, and I am not currently a D&D player, though I was in undergrad. I played in several campaigns, and it looked fun.
Yeah, it is.
Know?
It captures, I think, the spirit of like a D&D game, like the
seems like there's a little bit of chaos,
like larger than life like characters, kind of the way that like weirdness kind of weaves in and out of like fun D&D games where you just kind of like pursue a whim for a moment and then move on.
Yeah, that the side quests.
The side quests, exactly.
are part of the process. To me, it looked like, the reason why I have not seen it in theaters is, to me, it looked like a classic Saturday on the couch 3 p.m. viewing. Yeah, I can't wait. It drops on HBO Max or whatever Discovery is choosing to call it at the time.
Right. Max, the Max. Oh wait, is the Max isn't that from Saved by the Bell? No.
I don't know. I can't say that my
Listener,
my Saved by the Bell
tell
lore
me
is
if the
deep.
Max is a Saved by the Bell thing, because this is not worth looking up. I also saw Renfield.
What did you think about that? It seems like the reviews have been really divided.
I thought it stunk.
Oh damn.
Yeah, like all the Nick Cage stuff is like really fun, like real hammy. Like they there's a flashback to, so the Nicholas Hoult character is obviously supposed to be Renfield, but like Renfield from the original Bela Lugosi Dracula. So he's like, the beginning is like, I remember when I first met the Count, and it's like that old Universal footage, but with Nicholas Hoult and Nick Cage in it, like kind of redoing those parts, like really brief moments, which is a lot of fun. And then Nicolas Cage being like hammy as Dracula is fun, and then for no reason this movie is about a mafia crime story.
Okay. Yeah, that does seem like a pretty sharp left turn that's unnecessary in light of kind of a fun premise.
Yeah, and like kind of like I don't know, that like kick-ass style of like detached like irony action movie stuff that I'm not
so what I'm hearing is
of.
Like 20-year-old Hal probably would have loved this movie, and 32-year-old current Hal is gonna watch it at 3 p.m. on a Saturday on the couch.
And 26-year-old Craig just thought it was kind of stinky.
Oh, you're so young.
Thank
You're
you.
aging in reverse.
Thank you.
How vampiric of you.
But the one that I did want to talk about is I finally saw Scream 6, and
Hell
it's awesome,
yeah.
and I loved it. And I think you had mentioned on the podcast before that it was very brutal.
Yeah, I felt like it was crueler than some of the most recent entries.
Yeah, maybe not like as gory as some of the more recent ones, but like more heart-wrenching and like cruel and kind of just like shocking.
I mean, a knife being shoved down somebody's throat is
and the
unflinching
slow, ladder between two buildings death, and like that one was real brutal.
That set piece was so smart and dramatic. Because the thing about setting a horror movie in a big city is that all of the spaces feel very confined and fixed, right? They're getting trapped into an apartment. You're going, there's no pathway out of here.
Right. Yeah.
And then there is a pathway, but it itself is a trap.
Right. Yeah. It was, we haven't got to see Ghostface Home Alone someone. That's not true. He closes Rose McGowan in a garage in the first one. But yeah, I loved it. What about you? What have you been watching?
So last Thursday I saw Beau Is Afraid, or 2 Thursdays ago, excuse me. I saw Beau Is Afraid when it dropped. When it did its wide release. I really liked it.
Yeah.
But I did not seem to be having the same experience of the movie in the theater as the rest of the audience.
Okay.
In that, obviously, it is a surrealist comedy of sorts, but I did not feel like it was laugh out loud funny. I felt like it was, exactly for the most part, absurdist about the kind of gap that exists between horror of daily living in a very unusual setting, and like one's ability to cope with it. And a lot of the theater was like out loud guffawing for a significant portion of the movie, which was odd in my opinion.
So, like, I get it applause or like guffaws, excuse me. Was it like?
No, I think it was like an inability to be earnest about anything.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Like I think it was like making a joke out of, like, for example, Nathan Lane's character is obviously explicitly funny. I mean, he is designed as like the gayest heterosexual dad to have ever existed, and he speaks in very over the top dialogue that is like clearly intended to be laugh lines. But the first third of the movie is a dead sprint through a panic attack for Beau, Joaquin Phoenix's character, and people are just like cackling in moments that, to me, undercut the emotional impact of what was being displayed. So I don't know. I look forward to watching the movie again without a bunch of 19-year-olds surrounding me.
Yeah, I can see that. I can also see that in Ari Aster's, like, I haven't seen Beau Is Afraid, but like I feel like the other two of his movies, Hereditary and Midsommar, do have like humor in them that often I feel like I have a distinct memory of seeing Midsommar in the theater and like people laughing during the bear scene.
Right.
And,
yes.
Yeah, which is like, I guess in a vacuum, a funny visual or whatever, but like to have it be the cathartic moment, like
it's horrible.
It's
it's terrorizing. Yeah, I think his movies are maybe Hereditary less to a lesser extent, but both Midsommar and this movie I think are very. There's a wide range of interpretation that the audience brings to it. That there's a solid swath of it that I just do not relate to.
Yes.
Like, so in Midsommar, people interpreting the movie about being like a bad abusive boyfriend who deserves it. It's like, this man was not kind to her, but he did nothing to warrant being put in a bear suit. And so if that is your frame of reference and interpretive lens, I'm at a loss. And I feel like a similar Twitter-esque, TikTok-esque, distorted social media framework is being applied to something that could be a lot more complex and nuanced, but also is maybe even more simplistic. Like, this movie is about an abusive mother and how a man who is raised under her prison of expectations can't cope with adulthood and is tethered to her. And people are like cackling. I don't know, whatever. I did not enjoy my theatrical experience with it. The other thing I wanted to raise is that I watched After Hours for the first time.
I've never seen After Hours.
Yeah, it's one of the few Scorsese movies I have not seen. So I've been trying to cross them off my list because I'm a fan. My baby film bro, Bass, is very attached to Scorsese.
I was thinking your literal brother. Hal has a brother, and I was like, does your brother have a connection to Martin Scorsese somehow?
Sorry, no, film bro, like,
Your
me,
baby
like,
film,
to me,
yes.
loving film as like a
Yep.
16-year-old was like, I love Scorsese and Tarantino
Yeah.
and was interested, and then the world cracked open after that. But
Right.
those are definitely like my entry points. Especially like being raised in a family that, as I've talked about before, loved movies but really didn't know shit about cinema. So those were like the access points for me. So I had not seen this, and it was not what I expected.
Mhm.
And I can't wait to view it again.
Hell yeah.
It was tonally pretty different than what I was anticipating. I was expecting more of a like rollicking one night in New York, and it's lots of bad stuff happens.
Yeah, it's kind of like caustically funny, right?
Yes. And again, I would not say I considered most of it to be very funny.
Yeah.
not that there's no humor in it. In fact, I would say there's like more. I'm not comparing it directly to Beau Is Afraid, but yeah. So I'm closing in some, bubbling in some.
Hell yeah.
Unfilled dots. And this is not something that I viewed because it's a venue, but we're getting pretty close to like All Saints Cinema, which is a independent cinema in Tallahassee that's been closed since the pandemic, lockdown portion of the pandemic started. And they're supposed to be reopening. They're in the process of hiring people. And I'm just really looking forward to the world that will open, because they oftentimes, when they were open, prior to the lockdown, they would often play older films. Like the first time I saw Face Without a Name was there, for example. They often had new documentaries and new independent film screening there. So I'm really hoping that some stuff that haven't had an opportunity to engage with like a film going public, and specific types of movies that maybe have fallen through the gaps for me because there's not a venue for them.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to that shifting. I'm hoping this summer will be lots of good movie watching times.
And for non-Tallahassee people, it's in a really cool venue. It's in like an old Amtrak station that's kind of hollowed out and turned into a, I don't know, what, 50-seat theater?
Yeah, it's fairly small, but they just renovated that whole building. So I think part of why it was closed was not only initially, obviously, because of lockdown, but they have undertaken some renovations to it. So maybe it'll be larger. Who knows?
Hell yeah. Do you mind reaching over and closing that window? Sure. We have a rogue dog outside that might be you might be hearing the barks. Can I tell you about a bad theater experience I had with crowds that were too annoying? It was Scott Pilgrim vs. the World.
Ooh.
Which I love. I love that movie. But I saw it like opening night at midnight, and the whole crowd was just all so giddy at any video game reference they got, and it was so annoying. Like, it was dudes like shouting across, like, "That was Zelda, bro!" Or like whatever, like weird video game like constantly the whole time. And I remember leaving and be like, I hated all of this, and I had to like go back and see Scott Pilgrim again because I was so annoyed at everyone shouting the references they got.
Yeah, I have very strident and somewhat ambiguous and hard to define internal norms around movie going and when it's appropriate to talk and when it's not.
Oh yeah, me too.
And that is definitely like opening night of something that is not on a monumental level. Like,
right.
For example, if someone is talking or kind of making references during I've been in Star Wars releases, for example, Last Jedi, etc., where people like cheer or exclaim when something happens on opening night of something that is large and monumental. I don't mind so much. You should not be yelling out like phrases.
Or just full open communication across your 7 people that you went with or whatever it was.
Cult films that have an established expectation of there being some form of audience feedback.
Yeah, if you go to the
appropriate
room or Rocky Horror, you're going to be hooting and hollering.
Right.
But not like, I don't know.
Dramatic films, you should be fucking silent in 100% of the time.
I had to tell a dude to shut up one time that was cracking jokes during that movie Room.
the Brie Larson
Yeah.
vehicle
was-
about rape.
It was the part where like he was doing like the classic like talking to the character thing, but it was the part where she escapes and like flags, or the kid escapes. I don't remember what happens. It's the escape sequence. And the dude's like, don't do that.
As if it were a mid-budget horror movie.
Yeah. And he was like,
no.
Oh man, that cop needs, like, he was just talking to the characters, and I had to be like, hey, can you pipe down?
You should be so quiet I can't hear you breathing during a drama film.
Especially one like that.
Right.
But anyways, what's happening in the world this week that's got you either celebrating or in despair?
Well, I know you're just chomping at the
Hell
bit.
yeah.
So why don't we dig into the tragic comedy of Steven Crowder's eventful 2023?
Oh my God, it's been if you are someone who pays attention to conservative ding-dongs like me, then one of our favorite conservative ding-dongs is Steven Crowder, failed actor, failed stand-up comedian who has since just has a YouTube show.
Failed husband
Now, yes.
Failed father.
Big time failed father. So, for the uninitiated, in January, Crowder goes on his stupid show. There's a very funny YouTuber that I like named RM Brown who does a lot of videos on like right-wing ding-dongs, but he always calls Crowder, because of their weird set. Are you familiar with like Crowder's set? He calls Crowder's whole crew the Basement Boys, which I love. So in January, Crowder and the Basement Boys release a video saying that they received an insulting contract from a conservative media outlet. And
you did give a rundown of this in one of our
good.
first episodes.
So, long story short, basically Crowder was getting mad at a $50 million contract over 4 years with the Daily Wire. So his whole deal implodes with the Daily Wire. All this happens. So fast forward, April, it comes out that he, apparently, apropos of nothing, makes a video saying, well, it's time I address the rumors because they're going to get out, and that he's getting a divorce. He releases a hilarious video. Have you seen his hilarious video? Where he says a number of things. One, he reiterates, I believe, 3 times that the divorce is not the fault of his 1.5-year-old twin babies, which...
It was on the tip of everybody's tongue.
That's what
you
I
got to
was
get
like,
ahead of it.
It's probably the baby's fault.
Yeah, of course.
He also says that he bemoans several times that Texas is a state where you can just get divorced if you want to, because he didn't want to.
These motherfuckers are so uninventive that they have to reach back to the 1960s and 70s policy playbook. They have no ability to, draw the pen across a new page and say, let's go after no-fault divorce, as if...
that's the real enemy.
They're like, all these men are salesmen who have to trap their wives at home wearing aprons.
Well, funny you should say that, because after he releases this video, this stupid video of him addressing his divorce, presumably his wife releases a video through the Yashar Ali, a journalist with a Substack.
I just want to say, bless him for releasing this video, but
God.
Journalist is a little heavy-handed for this man.
A Twitter guy? I don't know.
Yeah,
that's what I knew him from, and then
has very little credibility.
Okay, well, releases it to a Twitter dude with a Substack. Yeah,
I am thankful that.
Oh hell yeah! Release it all.
Right, that it made it out there. Yeah. But this is canceled is a strong word, because it's not like he was accused of doing something horrible. It was just like lack of credibility, lack of standards, and having ties, like receiving a lot of funding and just not being like a legitimate journalist who operates without bias. Was that last summer or maybe last fall? So this is kind of his like next prominent moment. So there's this other there's this other like sub narrative here of him being like, I'm gonna gets back in good graces again, on the back.
Well, he did it for me. I'll take him.
Exactly.
So
stomping on the back of Crowder.
He released a Ring video of Steven Crowder arguing with his 8-month pregnant wife while smoking a cigar and wearing flip-flops on his back porch. And it's a really disgusting video. And essentially, he is berating his wife for not giving their dog the medicine that it needs because she's 8 months pregnant and the medicine may have health effects to pregnant women. And he's basically, at one point, he says, "If you love me, put on some gloves and do it," or something like that. And then there's several like really disgusting things. He gets mad at her for not doing her wifely duties. He says their marriage is at an impasse, and the only way that they can get over it is if she learns discipline and respect. And then the really, really scary part is at one point she says he is being abusive, and he says, "Watch it. Fucking watch it." Like he's gonna, I don't know, whatever, hurt her. And actually, this part's not in the video, but text comes up at the end of this leaked video that says, when they walked inside of the house, you can Steven Crowder can be heard saying, "I will fuck you up," to his 8-month pregnant wife.
And also, I mean, you skipped over it here, but from my perspective as someone, so listeners, I, one, am a survivor of a DV situation, and two, I worked as a victim advocate for several years before moving into case management and eventually food pantry work. And he refuses to let her drive their one car. And I mean, he is being emotionally abusive in this video, like you described. Obviously, there's I wouldn't even call it implicit. There's really an explicit threat in the right, watch it, or saying, "I will fuck you up." But the fact that he has multi-million-dollar deals and has one car is an intentional tool of control, right? And especially this kind of double bind of, you aren't doing your wifely duties by servicing me in every way, but also I'm not going to let you leave the house to accomplish any of those. It's really frightening display of dominance.
Yeah, and there's a really bizarre moment, because I'm a freak and I've watched this video like 6 times now. There's a really weird moment where he berates her for giving up on their marriage, I guess, and saying that they were at an impasse. And after I watched it like the 3rd time, I realized he is the first one to say our marriage is at an impasse. And then she says it is at an impasse, and that hurts his little feelings. And then he berates her just minutes later for claiming their marriage is at an impasse when he's the one that, like, yeah, it's just gaslighting through and through his whole.
Yeah, I mean, it's gaslighting, but it's also like he gets to, I guess it's part and parcel of gaslighting. It's like he gets to dictate the definition of the situation, and she isn't permitted to express her own, even to agree with him.
Yeah. One other funny detail that came out about this is about 2 years ago, he put these like cryptic messages on Twitter that he was having heart problems and this surgery because of he's got a bad heart, or he's got a bad chest situation related to his heart. No one really ever touched it because he just came out and said, like, I had surgery to fix my bad heart or whatever. So through all this, people have put the pieces together, and his ex-wife and her sister have come out and said that the surgery that he said that he had was an elective surgery that he scheduled around the time his wife was supposed to give birth. That's why he missed the birth of their kids. And it was an elective surgery because he has a sunken chest, and it was like put a rod in. And according to his ex-wife, this is messy as hell, but hey, it's Steven Crowder, I don't care. He did not like the way his chest looked. So as many people have pointed out, Steven Crowder had gender-affirming care performed because he felt that his chest was not manly enough. So just FYI to the guy that like wants doctors to be like executed for helping trans kids, had gender-affirming care.
Couldn't happen to a nicer guy.
Yeah. Cheers. But yeah. So before we move on to the reason we're here today, that sounded like I was officiant at a wedding. Let me just say, before we dive into our main film today, first off, let me say thank you to all of our listeners, and in a continued effort to appease the algorithm gods that drive all content, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share We'd love to grow our audience and could use your help. So while you're listening to the delightful sounds of my slightly obnoxious voice, please go into your podcast app of choice and give us a rating. Good ratings only, please. But anyways, let's talk about the movie we're here to talk about, which is Oliver Stone's film Platoon.
Yeah, so first we talked about starting with, before we fully launch in Platoon, talking about some historical context. I think it's good that we do this because something we'll talk about a little more later is that a lot of American Vietnam War movies, including Platoon, basically are not interested in situating it in a broader history. And I think as leftists, I've said this on the podcast before, as leftists, we have an obligation to understand and dissect imperialism and the ways in which America is implicated in that. So how we're going to do this is Craig's going to go into some history and I'll kind of weave some stuff in, but I wanted to start out with a quotation. And if you're not familiar, Annamese is a term that means Vietnamese that was used more widely during the early and mid 20th century. So the Annamese in general are crushed by the blessings of French protection. As peasants, they're robbed, plundered, expropriated, and ruined. It is they who produce for the whole horde of parasites, loungers, civilizers, and others. And it is they who live in poverty while their executioners live in plenty, and who die of starvation when their crops fail. This is due to the fact that they're robbed on all sides and in all ways by the administration, being the colonial administration here, by modern feudalism, and by the church. One can see that behind a mask of democracy, French imperialism has transplanted in Annam, again, Vietnam, the whole cursed medieval regime, and the Annamese peasant is crucified on the bayonet of capitalist civilization and on the cross of prostituted Christianity. Written by and said by Marxist-Leninist revolutionary and president of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh's. He wrote this in a French trade unionist quarterly magazine called Le Vieux Ouvrier, which means worker's life, in January 1924. So let's situate the film. This movie is about a war, and that war is about colonial struggle and the United States' geopolitical relationships in a world that's in process of remaking itself.
Yeah, the Vietnam War, as we think of it in America, began in 1954, when the French lost the First Indochina War at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and withdrew from Vietnam, a territory that it had occupied and colonized a century earlier in the 1850s. France's defeat created a power vacuum, and a civil war broke out between North Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union, China, and other countries in the communist bloc, and South Vietnam, backed by anti-communist nations, chiefly the United States.
And the Vietnamese reclamation against the French really started long before 1954, most significantly gaining steam in 1945 when the Viet Minh launched the August Revolution against the empires of France and Japan. Now, in 1946, classified communiques between the Secretary of State of the United States and the U.S. consul at Hanoi reveal that at that time, the U.S. didn't want to be in the middle, because at that point, the U.S. and France were wary of French communists, or the French left, labeling the United States interference as foreign imperialism, because basically, like, the French left was starting to rise up against internally in France. And because the U.S. and its British allies were pretty nervous following the failure of Korea. Then later, following that French defeat in 1954, the mid-1950s and early 60s were punctuated by a series of quote-unquote international peace processes and escalating imperial intervention. So in 1954, we have the Geneva Agreements on Indochina, which involved the division of the country along the 17th latitude parallel, which is what produced North and South Vietnam, and divided Ho Chi Minh's scope of power so that he no longer controlled the entire country. There are some scholars that have argued Ho Chi Minh accepted this agreement in 1954 to divide along the 17th parallel because he was trying to avoid direct American entry into the war at that time. He was very strategic, and he was known for being a pragmatist amongst being a Marxist-Leninist, and he feared that if the U.S. entered while the Sino-Soviet alliance aligned on the other side, that another world war would erupt just after World War I and World War II had finished. Then in September 1954, so later that year, the U.S. takes an aggressive step by forming the Manila Pact, or the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, known as SEATO. And that was guided by domino theory, which is really important to understanding Cold War in general. The underlying assumption here that the U.S. is operating on is that Vietnam was really a proxy for China, who was really a proxy for the Soviet Union, which is honestly extraordinarily stupid and doesn't understand that the China and the Soviet Union were not really aligned, especially at that point in time. And then in 1955, Ho Chi Minh says that the Geneva Agreement, so this 17th parallel division was supposed to happen. It was supposed to lead to a ceasefire. And he gives all these speeches and he writes all these things saying, like, they're not being applied. The U.S. isn't following it. He said in one of his essays that 805 people are dead, 3,501 are wounded, and 12,741 people have been arrested groundlessly, in this year, and accuses the U.S. of conspiring to interfere in the 1956 elections that were supposed to be a reunification process because the U.S. was refusing to organize a timely election. And we also see during this time period that the U.S. begins to establish this southern Vietnam as a military base. And then we see the 1962 Laos agreements, also in Geneva, where basically the U.S. and northern Vietnam, are fighting over different warring factions within that country.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Laos agreement, and Laos and Cambodia, the two neighboring countries, were actually drawn into the conflict when North Vietnam invaded the countries, basically to set up a network capable of transporting Viet Cong supplies and troops from North to South Vietnam, which became known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Yeah, and it's something I'd like to bring up when we talk about Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam is that it's important to note that Vietnam is really a multi-ethnic nation. One of the things that imperialism does is it flattens the history of a place, right? And Vietnam, due to its close proximity to China in the north and Laos and Cambodia in the west, plus indigenous hill people who have a long history of autonomous rule within Vietnam, there's really a very long-term legacy of regional entanglement and kind of a dialectical contest between struggle resistance and assimilation and adoption. So Vietnam's relationships with its neighbors have long been cast in the shadow of Vietnam's subjugation at the hands of aggressors, whether they be native to the continent, China, or not, France, the United States. Cambodia really became a protectorate under the French Empire to seek assistance from being caught in the middle of a war between Vietnam and Thailand. The inverse is true too. Vietnam faced reprisals from China, the US, and Japan via sanctions and military action when the Khmer Rouge used incursions into North Vietnam to gun run. So there's a lot of intersecting lines here of conflict and power. And if you're like, Hal, why are you talking about this? It's because I think the primary benefits of a critical leftist perspective on history is to problematize invisible assumptions of the narratives of imperialists, which basically all of us who are raised in the United States have embedded in our skulls. And to understand that Vietnam's trajectory is molded by, but not exclusively directed by the United States, especially when we're talking about something like a movie, which sometimes has the effect of depicting kind of like the emotional trauma of war at the expense of depicting the full narrative, and it kind of flattens history.
Yeah, and the U.S.'s involvement, they were involved from the very beginning, but it is important to point out that the United States never actually declared war on Vietnam. For 10 years, from 1954 to 1964, the U.S. engaged in secret wars using the CIA and other more covert forms of warfare to support South Vietnam. But it was in 1964, while a U.S. naval ship was carrying out an intelligence patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin, supporting South Vietnam, that they were fired upon by 3 North Vietnamese ships. Days later, a second attack from North Vietnamese on U.S. boats was reported, but this attack never happened. That didn't stop both President Lyndon Johnson and Secretary of Defense Robert Strange McNamara from using this erroneous report as justification for further U.S. intervention.
Yeah, I think something that embodies this well, kind of from the North Vietnamese perspective, is Ho Chi Minh in a 1965 address that he gave to his National Assembly called U.S. Imperialists Get Out of South Vietnam. Punchy to the point, love it. As the thief crying, "Stop, thief," is a customary trick of theirs, the U.S. imperialists, who are the aggressors, have impudently slandered North Vietnam as committing aggression in South Vietnam.
Yeah, and aggress we did, especially starting in 1965 when the U.S. launched Operation Rolling Thunder, the name of an operation of just carpet bombing meant to eradicate North Vietnamese forces and support South Vietnam. These bombing operations weren't just limited to Vietnam, though, because we also bombed Laos in an effort to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Yeah, and in kind of the middle of the war, right, in 1969, Ho Chi Minh died. But something that's really unique about Northern Vietnam and its kind of socialist communist parties is that the Workers' Party of North Vietnam did not experience internecine upheaval like the purges that we saw in places like the Soviet Union during crises of leadership. People generally stuck to the party line and kind of kept it trucking. They didn't stop just because the leader died.
Yeah, and again, it's important to note the U.S. never officially declared war, but they did proceed with BEAST tactics, that acronym that stands for bombing, escalation, air, artillery, search and destroy, and technology. Hubris and American exceptionalism led those in power to think that Vietnam would be a quick in and out operation. However, the U.S. just wasn't prepared for the North Vietnam and Viet Cong's increasingly sophisticated guerrilla warfare tactics, and the U.S. involvement in Vietnam quickly stalled and over the next few years morphed from a quiet Cold War proxy war into just full-scale disaster.
And, why was it such a disaster? This is something historians, activists, lay people have battled over for, 15 some years. But some of those common explanations include, that the imperial conflicts that we talked about before with China and with France helped cultivate a culture of resistance and really honed fighters. So people were kind of primed. They were ready to go. They understood how to engage in guerrilla warfare already. Some folks think that the specific geographic features of Vietnam, its hills, its dense and lush forests, played a role. There's also some argument over the South Vietnamese administration of Nguyen Dinh Diem, who was the leader of South Vietnam from 1954 to 1963, and who was a partner to the U.S. Some folks say that he really failed to integrate peasantry. If you have any background in Marxist theory at all, you know that there are pretty strong arguments that Marxism makes about the key role that the peasantry plays in moving a society and a political economy from feudalism into kind of the next stage of the teleology. And in addition to Diem not really integrating the peasantry of southern Vietnam, there was also conflict between the U.S. and Diem about what the goals of engaging the peasantry should be in the first place. It's also true, people make the argument that alliances of convenience can be very fragile, and that's why the U.S.'s incursion failed, that Diem's administration was nationalist in its orientation, meaning that his objectives didn't really align with the U.S. because ultimately he still wanted to pursue an independent Vietnam. He wasn't like a happy puppet for the U.S., basically. And another big one that I think should be particularly interesting to leftists is that as it relates to domino theory, right, or the idea that the United States wanted to stop other countries from falling to communism because otherwise other countries would subsequently fall like dominoes, that for the United States, goals changed in the 1970s as other Asian countries, such as Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, and Thailand, became really virulently anti-communist, meaning the fear of the domino falling was less significant. So the risk of pulling out was less dramatic. And I've talked on this podcast before about, I recently read The Jakarta Method by Vincent Bevins, which is about aggressive anti-communist policies in some of these countries, primarily Indonesia, and how it prevented a communist uprising in these places. So basically the United States calculus could shift because they weren't afraid about those dominoes falling.
Yeah. It was nice. I like that. A full, quick, brief history of Vietnam. You don't need to read any more books. You got it from us.
You can read the sources that we're going to put.
Yes, we will add our sources to the show notes. Before we get into Platoon, I think just for my edification, I do just want to mention a few people that I've labeled just the most bastardly of the Vietnam War.
People that we strongly encourage to rest in piss.
Yes.
Yeah.
Except for one. We'll get to him in a second.
Indeed.
Right.
Indeed.
First off, we've already mentioned a few of them. Presidents Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, who presided over most of the Vietnam War. General William Westmoreland, the Army general, who the Pentagon Papers ultimately revealed downplayed a lot of the losses, I guess, of the American troops in an effort to improve morale and kind of keep the war going. Robert Strange McNamara, the Secretary of Defense. I will mention, if you've never seen The Fog of War, Errol Morris's documentary, where he just pins his balls to the wall and doesn't let him go, basically.
Brief side note. The fact that McNamara does not leave or stop it, I mean, there's a fascinating psychological profile.
Deep down, he knows he has to atone, and like,
right, but
he's trying, but he can't.
Yeah, I guess it's just such a, Catholic framework to be like, stating it is itself absolution, as opposed to like, simply writing a tome of all the ways in which you're evil and should go straight to hell.
Our next bastard is the birthday boy himself, Henry Kissinger, who has just celebrated his 100th birthday because life is unfair. He was the State Department consultant. He was National Security advisor. He was the Secretary of Defense. His little fingers were all in Vietnam from beginning to end. And finally, Curtis LeMay, the Chief of Staff for the Air Force, who, when asked about his intentions in Vietnam, said, "We're going to carpet bomb them back into the Stone Age." Just wanted to, I don't know if they'll come up again, because Platoon isn't necessarily interested in the behind the scenes politics, but I do want to single out some of these bastards.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that there are ways of making movies that are about policy formation and its execution. So many movies about Vietnam, the war in Vietnam, made in America, are interested in the psychodrama of soldiers, who are inherently not the people making policy decisions. So I think it's good as leftists to operate on both levels, right? Both the micro and the macro. So I'm glad we are discussing it in the context of the history, even if, no one says Nixon's name or JFK's name for that matter. We'll say JFK is also very involved in the battle setting. Yeah.
I was trying to think, are any of our bastards we just mentioned in the movie at all? Maybe Johnson in passing, I'm
trying to remember if Chris mentions him during one of his letters.
Grandma, yeah.
But in general, no. Yeah.
It's always just the faraway choices being made that affect us here. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, we don't even see in the movie anyone above the level of battalion commander,
captain. I think at one point you see that when they go back to base, you see the captain,
right?
Who's he's the one that tells Barnes you're gonna be in deep shit if I find out something happened.
Right, but there's no one above him that's even depicted. Right.
So it sounds like we're ready to talk about the movie.
Let's do it.
So as the movie states early on, Platoon takes place in September 1967, somewhere near the Cambodian border. American soldiers have been fighting a losing war for years now, and morale was at an all-time low. And soldiers in many parts of the general public had become disillusioned and began to recognize Vietnam as a clusterfuck and a war the U.S. had no business participating in from the very first days of its involvement in 1954. The film is a study of the dichotomy in the American id as it relates to war. There's Staff Sergeant Barnes, played by Tom Berenger, who represents the U.S.'s exceptionalism, a capable warrior who views war as his profession and victory is as paramount, by any means necessary. And Barnes has no time for disillusionment. War is hell, and to survive, you must become a devil yourself. Opposite him is Sergeant Elias, played by Willem Dafoe, also a capable warrior who understands and appreciates the moral dilemma of war, especially this war. No less competent and skilled than Barnes, Elias has long descended into hell alongside Barnes, but refuses to let himself be counted amongst those devils. And caught in the middle is the protagonist, Private Chris Taylor, played by Charlie Sheen, who views himself as he says in the movie, a child born of these two fathers. Taylor recognizes and respects Elias's humanity just as much as he does Barnes' practical ability to turn off his moral governor and become a killing machine.
Yeah, towards the beginning of the movie, Chris, Private Chris Taylor, does a lot of voiceover that's dictating letters to his grandmother. And we'll know, as the movie goes on, he does that less and less. And so we can see him gaining more distance from anyone back home. But one of the things that he says very early during these voiceovers is hell is the impossibility of reason. And I think one of the strongest themes in this movie, and also, to be honest, generally American-made Vietnam War movies, is the absurdity of war. That you don't know what you're doing, and neither does anyone else, but also the stakes could not be higher at the same time. And so I think that, director Oliver Stone, who did serve in Vietnam and so is injecting clearly some personal shit in what's going on here.
You can tell some of the stuff is just so specific.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think that, when he has Chris say that hell is the impossibility of reason, that is what he is, he's setting up the whole movie, and that the conflict between the camps of Barnes and Alliance are kind of like, how does one resolve this contradiction between you have to know what you're doing and also it's impossible to know what you're doing, and there are no rules to follow, and everything is also highly structured according to rules, both known and unknown.
Right.
Also at this beginning part, we see Chris in a voiceover talking about his pathway into the war, which was elective. He was not drafted, and other soldiers' pathways into war. And he talks a lot about socioeconomic status and these other men being at the end of the line. And something I just wanted to inject here, because I looked up some data, because I think oftentimes there's kind of folk knowledge about people's socioeconomic status in the war, and maybe we don't actually know what that looked like in practice.
Right.
And I do think it's interesting that the draft lottery did not start until December 1st, 1969, which is after the plot of the film.
Yeah.
And also, during the Vietnam War, about 25% of the active military force in active zones were conscripted, meaning they were drafted, and the rest were not. Now, it doesn't tell the full story, because there is some data that suggests that the draft being implemented, people would enlist who were likely to be drafted in the face of that in order to have some choice over where they ended up and what division, they were part of, or what's the word I'm looking for? Branch.
Platoon?
What branch of the military? There we go. What branch of the military they were in. But we do know there were some studies in the 1980s that found that recruits of high socioeconomic status were underrepresented by half compared to their overall representation in the overall population in the United States. So basically, if you were poor, you were more likely to go to war. That could be via the draft. It could not. At the time that this film is depicting, the draft did not exist yet.
Right. Yeah.
But also we know that poor people are more likely to join the military because it's a paid meal. Maybe you didn't have any other economic opportunity. And so what Oliver Stone is capturing here reflects reality, even if reality is maybe like a little more nuanced than the way he's describing it.
Yeah. I love the framing device of like him writing letters to grandma. First off, it's just, you get like little glimpses of his life that kind of do the hard, because it is a lot of times in war movies, it's hard to find the humanity in the characters who are like literally just on screen because they're killing machines or whatever. And I feel like the little glimpses at Chris Taylor's like home life, like I don't think they ever explain it, but the reason that he doesn't want to write his mom and dad, because he does mention, like, don't tell mom this, don't tell dad that. Like, you just get these, like, little glimpses of his relationships home that I really like in those voiceover letters that he's writing.
I agree, and I will like be the first to say I don't typically love voiceovers in movies or in television for that matter, but I do think this is, like you said, an effective way of communicating that. It's also, again, the as it dissipates over the course of the movie, that conveys a lot. And also, I think there's something about like these men in this place that they don't want to be and that they don't know how to handle, that there's a wistfulness of like, it's something kind of romantic and like, I'm going to write a letter back home and describe
the other soldiers
things.
like give him shit for, and like they kind of comment on it throughout the movie that like, oh, you're still writing those letters home,
or you stopped,
or you stopped. Yeah, I haven't seen you writing to grandma lately. I think that's Forrest Whitaker says to him at some point.
Yes, there's something like romantic, almost like, oh, you can be like the Thoreau of the military experience if you are putting your thoughts and feelings in a letter that's being sent back to the United States.
Yeah.
And as the disillusionment sets in, then there's like less drive to try and romanticize it, you know?
Yeah. So Chris arrives in Vietnam, and played by Charlie Sheen, who's great in this movie. I would say the like 3 core performances in this movie are fantastic. I think everybody. I think all the performances are really strong. Of them, but the 3, Charlie Sheen, Willem Dafoe, and Tom Bergeron. All the funny things you do. Now I can't remember his name at all.
Bergener. Fuck.
I can only say Tom Bergeron now.
Berenger.
Tom Berenger. We love him.
He is fucking frightening.
Yeah. There is one
movie,
scene
my God,
where like his physicality in this movie is crazy. There's a scene where like one of the ambush scenes in the jungle where like everyone is scurrying and getting shot, and like it's just a scene of him walking like he's just like trying to get a jug of milk at the store, like just on a mission, could not be bothered by what's going on around him. And it is, he is a scary dude.
And I will say props to whoever did the makeup in this movie.
It's awesome.
Because that scarring
on
looks great.
Yeah. I always thought, I didn't really know who Tom Berenger was as like a teenager. I just knew him from Platoon, and I always just thought it was a dude with a scarred face.
Yeah.
Like,
it looks, it's very well executed.
Yeah, it's really good. So Chris shows up, and he's like low man on the totem pole because he has not been there. And when he shows up, like he is greeted by like bodies and body bags and just really awful sights. And, you know, he's kind of being prepared for this war that is really stalled out. And like I said earlier, is at an all-time low. He gets put on like the shitter duty where he's got to like clean out the gross, like, what do they call them? Outhouse latrines. Yeah. There we go. Yeah. And he kind of gets he shows up and he sees good things in both Sergeant Elias, Willem Dafoe, who's kind of got like this moral compass, and then Sergeant Barnes, who he admires for his like ferocity and just like ability to be a warrior.
Take no shit.
Yeah. And the first big like war sequence we get is on one of his first nights. Is it his first night?
I don't know if it's his first night there, but it is certainly like his first night on out there.
Like, yeah. So Chris is his first night on ambush patrol, basically staying up and surveying the perimeter of the jungle to make sure that the Viet Cong or North Vietnamese are not advancing on their position. He's there with Junior, one of the other soldiers, and Junior falls asleep on his post. Chris wakes up to see these Viet Cong coming, and a firefight breaks out. And we see like our first example of just, as you said before, like how chaotic war is, especially this war where like jungle warfare and guerrilla tactics, and it's really hard to tell who's coming, who's going, what's going on. And Chris is just in a state of like complete panic and shock and kind of frozen.
Yeah, that was a big note for me during that scene that I don't necessarily, I mean, I've seen this movie probably like 15, 20 times. But how just paralyzed he is. And you can tell, especially in the context of what he said, it's Junior afterwards, and the fact that it was in fact Junior. He was not, it was not his turn. That part of him being paralyzed is not just being afraid of what action he should take, but that he feels caught in this, like, it shouldn't have been, this ain't right. Basically, you know, like, the willfulness of like fighting against what the moment requires of him, and because he just keeps looking like, you should be doing this while the guy's fucking sleeping.
And you do start to see lines drawn of like those who kind of fall and look more like Barnes versus those who look more like Elias. Like we see Kevin Dillon, Johnny Drama.
What a fucking psychopath.
He's
really
great.
upsetting.
I really like him in this movie. He's insane. Like Kevin Dillon is clearly like the like insane magnified id of Barnes, of like just kill, destroy. And then you see a character like Forrest Whitaker who looks more like Elias, who's like one of the first ones to comfort Chris and kind of like offer words of advice and encouragement. So it is the movie early on kind of subtly drawing those lines between like killing machine versus those with some sort of like conscious behind what they're doing.
Right.
And then we get to the village, which is maybe the most upsetting part of the film for me.
Whew, yeah.
Yeah, so Barnes and Elias kind of establish this rivalry. They're both sergeants that
I will say this is a place where like I simply don't know enough about the military, because they repeatedly refer to Barnes as staff sergeant and Elias as sergeant. Yeah. So I don't know if there's intended to be a distinction. I mean, it's pretty clear. Obviously, the guy,
Lieutenant, whatever his name is,
Lieutenant,
the one that they all think is like
the baby bitch.
Yeah,
Lieutenant. He is supposed to be in charge of the Bravo battalion that they're all part of. And that most of the people that we see essentially are in like are in a power struggle over him, but that Barnes is very direct in subjugating him basically and stomping over his authority. But it's not clear to me if there's an actual distinction between Elias and Barnes' title.
Right. Other than it seems like, I think that's like where the writing is really good, that like, because they have this ineffective person above them, it kind of, even though one might be slightly higher ranked than the other, it puts them in kind of like an even playing field of playing for the support of the rest of the men in the platoon or whatever.
Right. There's a power vacuum.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a point where Barnes and his men and Elias and his men split up, and Charlie Sheen, Taylor, goes with Barnes ahead, and they encounter this village that is...
They go to the village specifically because there's a bunker that they clear and men die. It's booby-trapped. And then there's also one of their men who kind of disappears, and then they find him along the shore of the river with propaganda, with Northern Vietnamese propaganda, like knifed into him.
Yeah.
And so then when they stumble upon the village, there's retribution on the mind.
Yeah. And one of the voiceover things that Charlie Sheen says is one of the like most haunting in this part, is he says, "The village, which stood for 1,000 years, didn't know we were coming that day. If they had, they would have run. Barnes was the eye of our rage, and through him, our Captain Ahab. He would set things right again. That day we loved him."
Yeah, I think that's particularly poetic because the kind of implicit in the Captain Ahab is like on a search for something that's crazy to try and attain. And so it's very revealing that, you know, Chris says he would say he's like our Captain Ahab. He would set things right again. Because that reveals his state of mind in terms of like that something insane should be pursued and
Right.
that it's possible.
Yeah, and the thing that they're pursuing is kind of just a whim. They show up in the village and realize there seems to be like extra rice and some weapons that the North Vietnamese had kind of stored as a cache, but like it seems mostly this village is just a village
And
that's just caught in the middle of everything.
And there's a lot of children
Lot
and
of
women
children. Yeah,
that
yeah,
are that are shown.
Yeah, in a really upsetting scene, like Chris encounters a man and his wife, I believe, and the man has one eye and one leg, which I think might be
I don't think that's man and wife. See, I
the
interpret
mother and son.
Yes, I
Yeah,
interpret
okay.
it that way, and I interpret the man as being like differently abled. I don't interpret him as being
Oh,
prior VC.
Yeah, I think they do.
Oh, I agree.
And I did as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree that, or at minimum, they are acting on the impulse that any man in this space is.
Right. Yeah.
How I interpret the scene is this is like a young man who maybe has multiple compounding disabilities.
Yeah.
And they are torturing him because he can't fulfill what they're requesting.
Yeah. And we get like our first scene of Charlie Sheen, Chris Taylor, kind of like having a bit of a breakdown where he starts shooting at the feet of this guy, this one-legged man, and with Kevin Dillon being a nut job and like screaming and encouraging him. Oh, he also kills a pig for no reason. And then we get the scene where they kind of drag out all the villagers and Barnes is interrogating them, and he shoots a guy in the head with almost like no hesitation at all, and grabs a little girl and threatens to kill her if they don't give up this really ghost of like the North Vietnamese army that they think are like hiding out. They're just desperate to find any sort of intel or whatever. But
I think that it's so clear that it's driven by revenge and not by any like strategic claim.
Yeah.
Because he's not even I mean, obviously there is no justification for fucking murdering people, but I just mean like he's not asking questions about like where did they go after this, or do you anticipate them coming back, right? It's just like brute force.
Yeah.
Like that is all he has to offer is brutality.
And all of their evidence is like extra rice. Like it's just a very eerie like parallel to the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and like all the torture on very little evidence. But yeah, so we get this really brutal scene of them killing these captives. Barnes murders a villager, and then Elias shows up and kind of they have this explosive like little argument and fight, and this is kind of what sets up the main conflict of our story, because Elias now realizes that Barnes has committed war crimes, and Barnes, who is a smart dude, realizes this guy has a lot of integrity. He might say what happened here, and because of his position, people might believe him. And that's kind of what sets up the crux, the major conflict of the Elias v. Barnes rivalry. That makes rivalry makes
dynamic.
Like high school
I
football team.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I do think like, taking a step back and viewing it from an aerial perspective, it speaks to a very like the limited framework of like, and how this movie is like ultimately operating from a American imperialist perspective, is that what Elias is taking issue with is that he is killing people with quote unquote without cause, but that murdering anyone, right, that murdering Northern Vietnamese people on Vietnamese land is in and of itself not without cause, or that the cause is American imperialism. Like I understand why. I'm not saying like Oliver Stone shouldn't speak to his own experience, and it's not quite fair to judge a film by something it's not attempting to do, but I think that it is trying to cast a much wider moral distance than I myself perceive.
Sure. Yeah.
You know?
Definitely. Yeah.
Like, don't get me wrong. I prefer Elias to Barnes, but Elias is still...
Barnes seems like he's a fun guy.
But Elias is still fucking killing Vietnamese people. You know?
I love hanging out with people who, like, minimum 5 times a night are like, shoot me in the head right now. I dare you.
Do it.
Do it.
Do it.
Do it. Can I say that, okay. This is slightly tangential, but the
I love it. That's what we are. This is a podcast.
The most scared I've ever been at a party was I had, this just made me think of like whipping a gun out and being like, do it. I had a friend who hopefully doesn't listen to this, and who like was in like the ROTC program, like Officer Candidacy School. So I went to a lot of like Marine military parties in college, just tagging along with him. And the most scared I ever got was at one point this dude just busted out an assault rifle, like drunk as shit, walks into his bedroom, comes out holding it like with hella Barnes energy. And I was like, nope, I'm gone. Goodbye. And that literally might have been the last one of those military parties I ever went to.
I used to have a partner who was a roommate in college with a guy who was in ROTC and became a commissioned officer. And we were in their shared apartment when Osama bin Laden was killed. USA. And the guy who was in ROTC was actively sitting on the floor of their living room cleaning all of his guns. Because he had gone to maybe not all of them, but he had gone to the range. And so there was like 4 or 5 guns laid out, and he would clean them every time. No one could accuse him of not being diligent. He cleaned all of his guns every time he shot them, had them laid out across the entire floor of their living room, all of them, piece by piece. Was doing that anyway. I realized that, but at first I thought you were like,
Osama bin Laden's dead. I got to clean my guns.
No.
Which I liked a lot better.
No, in some ways that may have been better. Honestly, no, this was just this man's like exercise.
Yeah.
And then of course stuff started popping up. We started getting notifications, whatever. So we turn on the TV. Obama, says it. And then he brought out a boombox and proceeded to play a Toby Keith CD. Okay, what year was that? Was it 2011?
Sounds about
right. Was that 10, 11?
11 or 12.
Somewhere in that range. It wouldn't have been 12 because we were living elsewhere, so it would have been 10 or 11.
Then it had to be 11 because I got married in 2011, and I remember I was in the house right after we got married.
Okay, so...
You never forget where you were when Osama bin Laden was killed.
Forget.
When Chris Pratt killed Osama bin Laden.
He brought out a boombox and played that Toby Keith CD and sang loudly while finished cleaning his guns.
Was it the Boot in Your Ass song?
Oh, yeah. That album. Yes.
Hell yeah. God. Toby Keith, one of America's finest idiots. I do love Toby Keith in the most ironic of ways.
I can't believe I'm saying this unrecorded, but
Go
there
ahead.
are Toby Keith songs I can get down for.
Yeah, I mean, like, he does what he does well. Like, there's a reason he got, like...
I mean, I like a country song that you can sing along at a bar to. Now, obviously, I draw the line if that sing-along is based around jingoism, so fuck that shit. But...
I like a country song that you can really beat minorities up to.
I want to talk about me. I want to talk about the number. I'm just saying, there are options. What I do not view as an option is playing it on a boombox after Osama bin Laden has been killed while cleaning guns.
Actually, now that you say it... can I also say that he was in a movie that I think might have been a reference to one of his songs? I do not know. It is. I'm looking it up. But he was in a movie that I think... Okay, now I'm thinking it's based on one of his songs called Beer for My Horses. But I just remember
raise up our glasses against evil forces.
Okay. Cool. Well, here's what
it is for sure.
Here's what the DVD cover looks like.
No. That motherfucker looks like on the cover. I beseech you, listener, to look this up. He looks like a drag queen doing mask drag. Like his makeup, he looks contoured.
He does. His outfit looks like Larry the Cable Guy doing like a Mankind Cactus Jack.
Keep Cactus Jack out your mouth. I don't accept that. But you're right. You're right. Okay.
Wait, hold on. He plays a character in this movie named. Maybe we have to watch this movie for this podcast.
Oh.
He plays a character named. God damn it! I can't see what the last name is, but it's Joe Bill Rack is his nickname.
If you can find a way where I don't have to pay for it, I will watch this movie.
Oh wait, Willie Nelson is also in this. Oh my god,
Willie Nelson's in the song. It's a joint. It's a.
Oh,
I can't believe
that.
I know too
Hell
much.
yeah! Oh, you know who's in this? Oh no, now I might have to watch this. Gina Gershon is in this movie.
Wait, really? Okay,
Yeah.
we're doing it.
Yeah,
Ready to put
yeah.
it down. Write it on the list.
So back to Platoon.
Back to Platoon
After talking
and
about
the village.
Toby Keith. Yeah, so after the village sequence, the next day we get we get these kind of further line drawings where we get the great sequence of the two groups. The one all the like those kind of loyal to Elias in the bunks, like smoking weed and dancing
in the underworld. I love that because the dudes that are not part of the underworld, one of the guys, I can't remember if it's Junior, but one of the black soldiers says, "Man, I wish they would play some Motown," like complaining about all the white soldiers playing country music. And then it cuts to the underworld, and at the very end of that scene, they're all dancing to I think The Tracks of My Tears by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, which is one of my favorite songs of all time.
Hell yeah.
And so it's just this like the contrast between control and restriction and like kind of freedom and acquiescence, so just like falling into their station.
Because
Like
they're listening to, isn't it like Merle Haggard when it cuts over to him? He sings the Okie from Muskogee.
Yeah,
We don't smoke marijuana in Muskogee. Yeah.
And meanwhile, they're smoking marijuana and also opium, I think.
Yeah, that
based on
big
the implication.
crazy pipe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the fact that he's like way out of it. I'm like 1960s weed. Like you're not way out of it, bro.
Right. And then the next day is we get this amazing sequence, the like rain battle, the like downpour where there is an ambush. Did I miss something?
Yes.
Sorry.
Well, I just wanted to talk about in the wake of the village that the higher up that we see who's over the battalion, so I don't know if that's the captain, but the guy that's over like several battalions, says that he's going to investigate, but not right now.
Yeah.
He can't focus on it right now. He's got other things to do.
And he tells Barnes this directly, right? Like, so Barnes now has the specter of like this investigation and what he did in the village hanging over his head, knowing that Elias is the one who would be the most likely to be like, fuck this guy, and carries that energy forth.
And then I wanted to discuss the aftermath of the village for a moment, because I also think that there's a really interesting dynamic where all the black soldiers are gathered together and they're kind of discussing but also embodying the grander internal conflict between I think what the movie wants us to think is again steadfast ethic. Again, I would challenge that. But the Elias side of kind of the steadfast ethic, and then kind of the expedient deference to authority despite the moral cause, which is more the Barnes side. So we have like one of the soldiers says, Christians don't cut off heads, man. And then I think it's Forrest Whitaker's character says, like, I'm really hurting inside.
Oh, God, that line.
Woo!
So
I know
good,
the way he says it. It's like, damn, bitch. It's like 4 words or whatever.
Man, this cast is crazy, by the way. We've barely touched on it, but like this cast
the
is amazing.
Ensemble is nuts.
Tony Todd, another one that we didn't mention.
I know. Oh, God, when he dies. Fuck.
Yeah.
And then someone else stands up and says, Barnes got us this far. Again, like, we have survived, which is my moral imperative. Like, I don't care about any other like consequences aside from did I get out of here alive? And I trust Barnes to do that. And we see that reflected again because Chris has a voiceover before the next scene where he really describes group dissension and a loss of moral grounding. And it's clear at this point in time, I think this is like a fragmentation point for him, where his idealized hopes about serving his country have totally died. Paradise is lost, and he has also descended into the pit.
Yeah. And the next day is when we get the storm ambush, the one where like they're in the downpour, kind of doing their patrol, heavy rains, and the platoon is ambushed and pinned down. And to make matters worse, the ineffective lieutenant that is like kind of run all over by Elias and Barnes calls in artillery support, but with the wrong coordinates. So air support starts dropping bombs on their own troops, basically. And Elias and Barnes are arguing about tactics. And Elias has this idea, and I really like Willem Dafoe in this, just like the confidence of a man who knows his shit and knows what he's doing, and he's like, listen to me, I know what's happening. And he's right. He like says that like what they're trying to do is come around us, catch us in a crossfire. Let me take a group and kind of flank them and head them off. And he does that, so our group splits up, and Taylor goes with him, and we get to basically where the firefight kind of dies down. And Barnes, now realizing our platoon has been split, Barnes says, oh, I'll go find them. And eventually encounters Elias alone. And Barnes, in a great sequence, Barnes shoots him twice and leaves him for dead. And then sees Chris and tells him there's no use in getting him. He's dead. He's gone. And that's when we get that iconic scene of them like trying to exfiltrate in the helicopters, and Charlie Sheen looking down to see Willem Dafoe running out of the jungle like injured. He does the like, we've all seen the picture, the image on the cover, the fall to the knees, hands to the heavens, as he gets like lit up and killed by the Viet Cong that are rushing them. I did think there was I love Last Temptation of Christ, which came out right around the same time. There's like hella Jesus imagery. I will say that the first time we see Elias, I almost said Daniel Day-Lewis. Weird.
I'd watch that movie.
I think I said it because of Daniel Elias. That's a wrestler, right?
Elias is a wrestler.
Is Daniel not his first name? Who's Daniel Elias? Why is that name just a name that I popped off?
I mean, maybe it is, but Elias is a WWE wrestler whose gimmick for a long time was playing a guitar.
The guitar, yeah. Well, if we got any Daniel Eliases listening, write in and let me know that I might have been talking about you on accident. But we get the scene of when he is introduced, he has like a 50 cal that he's Willem Dafoe, that is, holding on his back like a cross. And then, of course, he dies with his arms outstretched. So, like, clearly he is the kind of savior, Jesus figure of the bunch.
This is what I mean, that the movie, like, has an inherently imperialist perspective.
Right, because we wouldn't have made that guy Jesus, even though he is the better of the two.
Right. None of these guys are fucking Jesus because they're operating on behalf of the American army.
Yeah.
And him being better than Barnes, I'm not a moral absolutionist in that, like, there is no distinction, but him being better does not mean that he is suddenly good.
Yeah, right. And as far as the plot goes, what this triggers is because Barnes tells Taylor that he died, there's no saving him, and Taylor sees him emerge from the jungle before he is ultimately killed. He knows that Barnes isn't telling the truth. And so, like, he begins carrying the flag of Barnes is this monster. And that's kind of what will thrust us into the climax of the movie.
Dun, dun, dun.
How do we like the spoiler alert, our conservative review that we're going to get to is going to touch on this a little bit, but how do we like the sequence in the rain and the like nastiness of like just that the depiction of like jungle warfare? I love that whole sequence.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this movie is well made
for sure
in terms of its visual coordination, right? The way it's framing shots. And I think that things are really legible, which is a challenge in war films in general, especially like the messiness, movies that are about the messiness
like,
of war.
It's chaotic, but still like understandable.
Can I see what's happening, right?
Yeah,
or does it look like a fucking Michael Bay Transformers movie that's metal on metal and I have no idea what's going on?
Do you know that there's a gorilla robot in the new?
I have seen it. I refuse. I don't think I've seen the last two Transformers movies.
Crazy.
But you know what I mean? Just where
does it transform into something?
Yes, a car. Oh,
I've seen. Gorilla also is a car.
Oh yes.
What kind?
I want to see that. I want to say that Anthony Ramos is in it.
Oh, he is. Yes, he's the human.
In the trailer.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
he's riding in it. So I think it became like an Aston Martin or something.
Cool.
Kind of schlippy. I don't know. I'm not a car person, except for cars that I care about a lot.
Teslas.
Plymouth Prowlers. 1998 to 2001. That's my shit.
Yeah?
If you're listening to this and you love me and you have approximately $38,000, they're not terribly expensive for a nice car. That's what I need to be in. That's my Grease fly away at the end of the movie vehicle.
I'm more of my fantasy car, more of a Hyundai Venue kind of guy.
Look at you shooting for the stars.
Did it, made it. Also, my dealership that I have to go get service from has they're very slow. They take forever to do everything. And they have the shittiest massage chairs that I can't stay away from. So, like, literally every time I go, I sit in these awful massage chairs for like an hour and a half and 2 hours, and then feel like I've gotten hit by a truck for the next 7 days.
They're placating the working class.
So anyways, Hyundai Venue, if you're listening, let's update those massage chairs. They're old. They're a little gross.
Hey, I've went to Costco 5 times in a 7-day period of time because of a combination of personal and work needs.
Yeah.
And they've got those dudes there selling the fancy chairs that cost thousands of dollars.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Like
right next to the
ones?
yogurt for some reason. So we need to get the Hyundai dealership connected with
What up,
the
y'all?
Costco.
God, kind of able to walk out of these
guys.
dealerships not feeling like I'm been hit by a train.
That you were in a car accident?
Yeah,
That's what it sounds
right.
like.
So
The final ambush? Is that what we're leading towards?
we're getting towards the final ambush, kind of the climactic scene, and this is also where we realize that our they've been in North Vietnam this entire time, but in the final third of the movie, they have crossed over into Cambodia, and we see that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese are kind of, I believe what they say is they're patrolling their line, essentially like popping out of the jungle, taking pot shots, trying to draw them further into the jungle because, as we've learned in the years that North Vietnamese had a huge upper hand in the fact that it was jungle warfare. So they're trying to draw them in. And we do get a really, really great scene that I love, even if the practicality doesn't quite make sense, but the one where Charlie Sheen kind of is like rallying the troops against Barnes. And then the reveal is that like Barnes has been in the corner
listening.
of the room the whole time.
And also drinking, which we have not seen him in those social scenes before. So the consequences of his madness are pulled to the surface in a way. The
closest he gets to like letting the mask fall or whatever.
Yes, yeah, I think that's definitely the intention.
Yeah, and he has a few like several great lines. The one where he says, "There's 6 of you boys, kill me," and it's just Tom Berenger, and he's great in these scenes.
I love when he says, "I am reality."
Yeah. He has a lot of great lines, like because he is supposed to be like the macho embodiment of like war, the kill machine, or whatever. So like he gets a lot of these that in the hands of a different actor or a different movie might have come across as like corny or cheesy, that he really delivers with some weight and like ferocity.
If you told me that man had actually murdered someone in real life, I'd be like, yes, believable. He's
wild.
The goods. He delivers.
So good.
But I love when he says, "I am reality." I think it speaks so much to his camp, as we've talked about throughout, of like the Barnes versus Elias, where like part of what is happening on the Barnes camp is men who in this context are like a closed system, a closed self-enforcing system where they define what the definition of the situation is, what the reality is, they act according to that, and then it just kind of cyclically produces itself. So I interpret you as an enemy, I shoot you, therefore you are the enemy, therefore the people that you're around are the enemy, and it just like kind of cascades into madness. So I love when he says that line, "I am reality," because like that's what he spends the whole movie doing, is defining his own reality in service of the war machine. Yeah.
So once in Cambodia, the platoon is ambushed again by Viet Cong who are patrolling up and down the squad line. And during the siege, Taylor has a chance to retreat, but doesn't. It's a great sequence where he instead stays and he uses his claymore to stop advancing VC. And at one point, yelling, "It's fucking beautiful!" And we see that he's kind of turning into this killing machine that he idolized in Barnes at the beginning of the film. But then we have this moment where Barnes and Taylor encounter each other in the jungle, much like Barnes and Elias had before. And Barnes is just going to straight up beat Chris Taylor to death with a shovel. And then they get interrupted by this mortar fire. And there's kind of like haze and confusion. And when the smoke clears, we see that Barnes is wounded and Taylor kills him, shoots him twice in the chest, and essentially deploying the same morally dubious tactics that he learned from Barnes, but to try to live up to this morality instilled in him by Elias. And it's just a great scene where this time Barnes goes, "Do it," and there's not even like a second that passes, and he fires both shots into him.
Yeah, I think it's there is an interesting resolution of internal contradiction that happens there. And I think that Barnes saying "do it," he's begging him, but also betting that he won't.
Yeah.
And there's just nothing left. There's no moral wall left for Taylor to climb.
And it's I think a testament to the movie and like how well it portrays that like moral dilemma is that like it doesn't feel like a cathartic kill in like a movie when like a bad guy gets his comeuppance. And like Barnes is a bad dude, but because of the like moral ambiguity that it's trying to picture, like doesn't feel like the villain getting his like, just desserts or whatever.
No one's winning here.
Right. Yeah.
And it connects to something. One of the things I really like about the end here is that it demonstrates the inescapability of war. Like Red's resolution or lack thereof is one of my favorite parts about the ending, where he pretended to be dead to survive this ambush along the line, right? He's in one of the holes and he throws someone else's body over him rather than try and escape or fight. And then when he's rescued by this roving band on a tank, he's immediately assigned a new battalion to run. Like, he doesn't get rest. His dreams of R&R that he brought up to Barnes previously, that Barnes rejected when Keith David's character got pulled on the chopper a couple of scenes previously.
Oh, God, we didn't even mention Keith David.
Right, Keith David, great.
And John C. McGinley, who is Red, right?
Yes, exactly. And so Red from Scrubs.
We love him.
Yeah. But he, he's like a rat. Right? Like, he engages in just like whatever he has to do to survive just to get that like moment of fresh air. And the second that the smoke clears from all the guns firing, they're like, "Nope, back at it, bitch." And something else I wanted to bring up here, and there's like moments of it throughout. So it's, Barnes killing Elias is related to this. Taylor killing Barnes is related to this. At the beginning of the movie, we see that the whole reason they end up entangled in their initial situation, their initial conflict, is because battalions were misdirected and like the Alpha Company didn't show up when they were supposed to or whatever. Or when the shitty lieutenant, Wolf, I think, gives the wrong coordinates and bombs the group during the previous ambush, which I think is supposed to be the Tet Offensive because they say New Year's Day, 1968. I want to talk about friendly fire for a minute. And part of it is because this movie, and part of it is because we've talked about this a little via text, but I recently finished listening to the Krakauer book Where Men Win Glory, which is about Pat Tillman. And I've just been like researching friendly fire more because I didn't realize how common it was in basically all war. And it's so the difference between friendly fire and an accident is like you fucking kill somebody and you didn't mean to, right? But friendly fire is when you meant to kill that person, but you misidentified who they were. Or, as in the case like Barnes, you intentionally killed someone that you know is on your side.
Fragging, I think, is the other like term for it.
So I tried to look up some data because one of the things that was driving me crazy in Krakauer's book, Where Men Were in Glory, he says that something like 39, I think the exact quote is like 39% of deaths in Vietnam were friendly fire, which
crazy.
I was like, that's insane.
Yeah.
Because I was listening to the audiobook, I could not find the source for that.
Mhm.
I did find National Archives data for the United States that said about 18.5% of U.S. deaths in Vietnam were non-hostile initiated, meaning they were accidents, illnesses, or friendly fire. It was not broken down beyond that. And I think like as a leftist, I often think about the ways in which our decision making, by our, I mean just people, individuals, decision making is constrained by structure and also places where autonomy exists. And friendly fire is like a very weird place that exists because there can be conflicting principles between hierarchical decision making and other rules. So it's about, in a dialectical sense, contradictions between competing principles. So an example for that would be in the case of Pat Tillman, the contradiction would be that you're supposed to identify who you're shooting before you shoot them.
Right.
That's a rule.
And so let me, because I read that, but it's been a long time. It was, if I remember, Pat Tillman was with a group that was on like a ridge of a canyon, and the people down below just saw like silhouettes and started firing.
Yeah. So what happened is there was, I believe, a battalion who one of their Humvees broke down, and higher up command told them that they had to haul it out. You couldn't leave it and destroy it because someone super high up had to give consent for that, and that person wasn't available to give consent or something. So they were split up into two groups, and one group was supposed to go one direction, one group was supposed to go the other direction. And Group B ended up following Group A instead of going in a different direction. Pat Tillman was part of Group A. Group A was up on a hill, basically above a like a valley area. And Group B followed Group A even though they were not supposed to. They did not communicate that they did it. And then Group B started shooting up at Group A and hit Pat Tillman, and he died. So the conflict here in the Pat Tillman case is there's supposed to be hierarchical decision making, meaning if your commander says shoot or they are shooting in a direction, you should follow them. Yeah. And then the other principle would be that you're supposed to identify who you're shooting before you shoot them. Now, what if these things are in conflict, meaning your commander is shooting in a direction, but you cannot identify who they are shooting at, right? So, and that's what happened according to the men that shot Pat Tillman. Right. What they said is basically their commander was shooting in one direction, and even though they couldn't identify, they followed suit and they killed him. So what happens here in instances of friendly fire like Pat Tillman's is that the contradictions that emerge are left to the individual to resolve, while authority gets to abdicate responsibility. They don't acknowledge the contradiction, or they point to one that should have taken precedent without offering a reason why that was the case. And so I just think that's interesting because I think it's a way in which power gets to be slippery. Mm-hmm. Power can claim hard and fast rules when it serves them, but engage in denial and sidestepping when it doesn't serve them. And I do think that that's like reflected in this movie, when we see various people, various leaders engage in friendly fire, intentional or accidental, against their own people. No. Before we get to the conservative review, I wanted to take a minute and talk about...
I did want to ask you one thing about Pat Tillman thing.
Yes.
Have you ever seen the video of his brother giving a speech at his funeral?
I have, yeah.
It's heartbreaking. Also, like, we didn't really mention this, but Pat Tillman's death was basically propagandized and covered up and used, because he was an NFL player, used as like a symbol of patriotism, even though Pat Tillman himself was pretty disillusioned with the war and didn't really believe any of this stuff.
At the time of his death.
At the time of his death, right? He joined with a kind of rah-rah spirit.
And that's why I started thinking about it. I mean, again, aside from me having finished it very recently, part of why I was thinking about it a lot is because I think his trajectory is not dissimilar to what we see with Chris, where Chris at the beginning of the movie is saying, I wasn't drafted. I did this because I thought.
Right.
He literally says, I thought, why should like the poor people do it? You know, I should do it too. And that was like literally Pat Tillman's reason.
Yeah.
Is that Pat Tillman said, you know, and Pat Tillman's family had a history, like I think his dad and his grandpa and his grandpa like had all served in the U.S. military. But I saw a lot of parallels there of like young men being like, this is an honorable thing for me to do, and having no fucking idea whatsoever what they're walking into.
Yeah.
You know? So I'm going to talk about how does Platoon compare to other Vietnam War films, because we didn't do a top 3 for this, you know, and instead I thought maybe just kind of a little bit of a general conversation about it compared to other Vietnam War films would be good. So at the beginning of our discussion of the movie, Craig, you said this movie is about American id. And I think in some ways that's its strength narratively and emotionally. But I also think that that's its weakness. This movie is really focused on psychologizing the American man's military experience in Vietnam. It's about the psychodrama of GIs, both inflicted and received, and the Northern Vietnamese, and really just frankly like Vietnamese people in general, are very flat foils. And I think the movie makes it super clear, like from the beginning, that this is its goal. When it starts with this biblical quotation, "Rejoice, O young man, in thy youth," like that's not about Vietnamese people. That's about Chris Taylor.
Yeah, American men, young American men.
Yeah, and their experience with it. And I do think this is not specific to Platoon. You know, I think that Full Metal Jacket is also very much about that. I think Apocalypse Now is like a little bit more about the absurdity of war in a broader sense. Like I think Kurtz is supposed to be about an imperial critique of imperial powers in a place that they don't understand. I mean, we see French people in Apocalypse Now, and so it situates it in a little bit of a broader context. I think Deer Hunter is very much about psychologizing. You know, Fog of War that you brought up.
Yeah.
Where do you think this fits in that?
Yeah, I love Fog of War, but I was going to bring up a few that are less, still about Vietnam, but less about the war aspect that I enjoy. Fog of War being one of them, which is a kind of tete-a-tete between Errol Morris, the filmmaker, and Robert McNamara, which we mentioned earlier. Another one, I love like journalism movies. Like I just love movies about people like figuring it out.
Same.
Yeah, and I loved The Post. I don't know how you feel about that, but I'm going to call that a Vietnam movie. The Post about the publication of the Pentagon Papers, which ultimately proved the president and all the higher-ups knew that Vietnam was a lost cause, basically from the very beginning, but kept it going.
And that would be an exception to what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
That it's not purely about the psychologizing of the American GI in the context of their violation, you know, the American government's violation of them, and then by extension their violation of Vietnamese people. You know, it's more about policy.
And the other one I wanted to mention, well, I guess technically other two, which definitely is about like psychologizing the American GI, but Rescue Dawn, Werner Herzog's Rescue Dawn. And have you seen that one?
I have. Yeah.
And have you seen Little Dieter Needs to Fly?
I have not. We've talked about this before. Yeah, I have not seen it.
Rescue Dawn is the
like fictionalized
narrative, fictionalized version of this dude, Dieter Dingler, I think his name was, who was just this dude, this German guy who came to America at a young age, obsessed with planes, joined the Air Force, got shot down and tortured. And because it's Werner Herzog, it's like a, you know, man versus nature, like Sisyphus. I was going to try Sisyphusian.
Boom, you got it.
Did I?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
but yeah, I love those movies. The two Dieter Dingler movies.
Yeah, love a Herzog moment.
God.
Have you seen any Vietnamese made / produced movies
I was
about the war?
just trying to think if I have, and I don't think I've. I was even looking up to see if I've seen any.
Yeah, so I have to say I have not. That was like a important moment of reflection for me in writing some of this for today's episode. So I found some recommendations across a variety of sources that I want to name, and I'm going to personally aim to try and view one of them before we record our next episode. Maybe report back. So the ones that I have listed here are the 17th Parallel, Nights and Days, which is in 1973. The Little Girl of Hanoi, 1974. The Abandoned Field, Free Fire Zone, 1979. When the 10th Month Comes, 1984. My understanding is that movie, unlike the other ones, doesn't show the war, but shows like people living just outside of where active war is occurring. Okay. But at the same, concurrent at the same time. And then The Scent of Grass Burning, 2012, which was at the time what Vietnam submitted for their foreign language film contention for the Oscars for that year. So it's the most recent one I could find. So I'm going to try and pursue one. I did see that some of the older ones are available like on YouTube. So I might try and check it out and make sure we're spanning the perspective and not only taking in American views on this imperial battle.
Hell yeah. I did think of one more that I wanted to mention.
Yeah.
Which is when we talk about I love this movie just in general, but like also as a movie that kind of is able to a recent Vietnam movie that's able to kind of take the perspective of like looking back as what a disaster was.
Five Bloods. Yeah. Yes.
Five Bloods is awesome.
Great.
Just like a bunch of old dudes that trying to kind of make sense of, a bunch of like Chris Taylors essentially that were like roped into this nightmare and now are old men trying to like make sense of whatever it was they were doing.
Yeah, I also think it's interesting because obviously Platoon is aware of the very specific dynamic of Black GIs, in that like there are it is understood that racial division exists that is carried over from the experience in America, even if it's not made super explicit. It is reflected in the social organization of the troops and the way they like seek support from each other. Like we see it.
Yeah, and it's implicit in that scene you talked about earlier where it's like the four of them talking, like that they're like, we need to discuss this because we know that we have this like bond or brotherhood that these other GIs don't understand or whatever.
Right.
Even though it's not said out loud in the movie, but
but it is embedded in in the movie. But Defy Bloods makes it very explicit the ways in which Black GIs were navigating a complex situation of being forced into a situation that they didn't want to be in, killing on behalf of a government that didn't fucking care about them and that was subjugating them at home, and how they were kind of caught in the crossfires of that. So I agree. I love that. And Delroy, what's that?
Delroy Lindo.
His performance in that movie is so fucking choice. It is primo shit.
So good. Yeah. So now, Hal, are you ready to be angry? Because we're going to return to our conservative review. And no, Armond White did not review. Well, I'm sure he did somewhere, but I could not find an easily accessible Armond White review of Platoon. But sticking with Armond White's former publication, the National Review, I did find another conservative critic that I've long loved for his idiocy. It's a man named Kyle Smith. And I asked you before, and you're not aware of Kyle Smith?
I mean, so here's what I'll say. I've brought this up before, but my partner will sometimes read primarily Armond White, but not always, National Review articles to me out loud for us to collectively rage at together. And so I'm sure, but the name itself is, very aggressively generic white man.
It is.
So.
And so is his face and general appearance. But if Armond White is the master of film criticism for the sake of agitation and contrarianism, then Kyle Smith is his star pupil. Like Armond White, Smith wrote for the National Review for years until he left just a year or two ago for the Wall Street Journal, a whole nother conservative rag. But unlike Armond White, Kyle Smith's film literacy isn't nearly as vast as White's, and oftentimes his reviews are not just objectively wrong, but like seemingly missing the entire point of the film itself. For example, he has this infamous 2015 article for the New York Post that called "Women Are Not Capable of Understanding Goodfellas." And he articulates that women can't understand this beloved classic because it is a male fantasy, outing himself both as a man who has no understanding of women and a man too stupid to realize that if you think Goodfellas is a male fantasy, then you are exactly the kind of toxic douchebag that Goodfellas portrays and condemns. And that is truly what is at the heart of Kyle Smith, a deeply insecure man with a terribly flawed understanding of masculinity, which brings me to his hilarious 2021, a recent revisiting of Platoon, in an article he wrote for National Review called "The Years Have Not Been Kind to Platoon's Macho Melodrama." And I want to highlight a few of his funniest takes about masculinity and war, because this dude does not get it at all. Basically, we commented earlier on how like Tom Berenger kind of delivers these like really like brutal lines, and he repeatedly in this review like writes that off as like macho one-liners, which is very funny to me. But one of the funniest things at the beginning is he gets really mad at Platoon, and he says that this film just doesn't understand what it means to be at war, not just with an enemy, but with the elements. It doesn't capture that correctly. And Kyle Smith knows that it doesn't capture that correctly because he was in the ROTC program in Connecticut at Yale. This is literally what he says. I want to quote from him that he says, "I know I didn't see it clearly the first time because I was viewing it through the darkened lenses of my own Army career. I was an ROTC cadet, spending one godforsaken weekend a month in the wilds of Connecticut doing pretend battle with the Viet Cong." He's doing a little wordplay there. "And anything that reminded me of these training exercises got my dander up. Watching Platoon put me in the mood to blast some napalm into the projection booth. I hated Platoon because I hated its impeccably rendered feeling of rain. Ever been rained on for 36 hours and tried to sleep in it, squeezed in under a branch in a hole in the ground? That's what I got out of ROTC."
Is he claiming that he slept for 36 hours, or he stood outside in the rain for 36 hours in Connecticut?
That is what he's saying, yes. And I'm unclear, because there is one point where he seems like he is saying that the rain scenes look nice, but also not believable, because he was in ROTC at Yale.
Can you imagine? I was going to say,
he's a dork.
Can you imagine writing this and not being afraid of getting your ass fucking handed to you by an actual vet? Again, I want to make it clear. I embrace all vets who throw off the shackles of the U.S. military and are ready to use the skills that the U.S. military taught them in service of liberation.
Hell yeah.
That said, I hope that a vet, regardless of their feelings about liberations, beats the shit out of this man after like accidentally reading this.
Yeah.
Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, he went on a camping trip in Connecticut and now thinks that he understands jungle warfare.
I have been camping in the rain. Last year, I went camping in the rain at Kalamoki Mounds, and it started raining.
So you were in the shit, huh?
Most of our friends left, and it was me and 3 other people out of like 20 left, and I brought out a card table and we played cards in the rain, and I had to put like an umbrella over us, and it was really hard, and that set of cards I used really fucked up. So basically I know what it's like to be in Vietnam.
I'm really sorry.
I know.
Did you get a Purple Heart for that?
Do you think that Kyle Smith would
he
feel
would offer
camaraderie
a shoulder to cry
with me?
on. Yes, 100%. He also, like I mentioned before, like does not get that the macho-ness that like is seemingly portrayed in the movie is kind of the point, that like the Tom Berenger like rah kill 'em all, let God sort 'em out thing. And he says, there are no layers to suss out. There is nothing to ponder. It is not designed to be watched more than once unless you like watching firefights punctuated by dumb macho one-liners. In this case, classed up with a bit of Baroque music on the soundtrack so you don't notice that you're bathing in war porn. Also, I don't feel like this movie is excessively, like, there's 3 big battle sequences, like fighting sequences. I don't feel like it is excessively war porn.
It's odd to me. I don't necessarily disagree with that critique, because I will say, the music in this is one of my least favorite things. It feels overly like sentimental and like just like it is trying to class up something that can't be understood in that framework. And to the extent that it's like I guess I don't understand. We reach another point again, like the shitty conservative movies we watch, where I don't understand a conservative critiquing it in that way.
Yeah, isn't that what you want? Is war porn?
Right.
Yeah,
like what is an appropriate depiction of Vietnam to you? Because I mean, I agree. I think there's a lot of parts of it that are overly brutal and maybe can be interpreted, again, especially the Elias stuff, as like glorifying some form of American interventionism. But I don't understand a conservative's line of thinking.
Yeah, and I think the heart of why he doesn't like this, and maybe some other conservatives don't, is because they view Oliver Stone as like a left-wing freak that's making like propaganda or whatever, which he says several times. He calls it like knee-jerk leftism, which is kind of a lazy critique. And then we get our return of his little Goodfellas problem, which is that he is just a complete moron that doesn't understand that depictions of brutality on film are not endorsements of said brutality. He writes in his review, the film was a flag waver. Platoon is a flag burner, bitter and ugly. Within the span of a few weeks, Stone's GIs casually murder villagers, burn down huts for no reason, and incessantly discuss murdering one another, as if the film has nothing to say about any of those depictions.
Or that GIs weren't doing that.
Right. That's the other thing, that like, okay. Yeah, exactly. He's acting like as if that is some spice added on to like sexy up the Vietnam War, and not literally the crux of the movie is dealing with these like acts of brutality.
Or again, like he's almost like falling into like the Elias trap of there is the noble exercise of war,
right,
on behalf of an imperial power, when it's just like simply that does not exist.
Yeah.
It ain't real, sir.
But yeah, so that's Kyle Smith, his review of Platoon from the School of Armand White. I think that's just what I'm going to call anything that comes from the National Review, the School of Armand White.
Let us burn down the School of Armand White.
Hell yeah. He did that himself, honestly. He burnt that down all by his lonesome. But yeah, Platoon, this is a great movie. I love this movie. I feel like I say that almost every time when we wrap up, that I love this movie, except when we did this Ben Shapiro movies.
Ben Shapiro movies. Yeah, I definitely like get in a zone where I just like watch Vietnam War movies. It's a mode of mine.
I'm trying to think which ones I've watched. I saw I rewatched Full Metal Jacket recently.
So did I.
I like that movie a lot.
Same. I also, as I said in the intro, I rewatch Apocalypse Now.
Oh yeah, I need
Redux
to rewatch that one
pretty frequently.
I don't know if I've ever seen the Redux.
The Redux is the reason why, I will say, brief justification. I think I've said this on a previous episode, but the reason why I like Redux the most is because it includes more of the Playgirl or the Playboy models, like the women models that they encounter.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that having that little brief vector that connects back to the United States, and also its implications for understanding like the sexualized violence that is inherent to the form of domination that these men are engaged in, strengthens it. It also adds to the absurdity because it's like they're in spaces that are entirely men, and then they're like cast in relief in these spaces that have like a lot of women who don't know what the fuck are going on and are totally like discombobulated by the situation that they're in. Also, I believe that the scene with the French colonialists is longer in the Redux.
Okay, I'll have to watch that because I have never seen it.
Yeah.
I will shout out, and I think I've said this on the podcast too, but Hearts of Darkness, the documentary about the making of Apocalypse Now, I love that movie so much.
Hell yeah. I have not seen it. It's like hard to find.
May have it.
Oh.
I'll have to look when we're done. But yeah, anything else to say on Platoon?
I would just say, as I've kind of said throughout, I know I've been a little preachy this episode, but I think it's like really important for us to not just accept and swallow the narratives presented by the American government, and that our critique has to step beyond just like the Vietnam War was like bad and we killed people, into like, why were we there? Why were we doing what we were doing? And how is it connected to the imperial project, which is tied to colonialism? Like, I think we always have to keep our eye on colonialism and imperialism. And next episode, do we want to tease it?
Do we want to tease it? Oh, yeah, because we're going to have a very special guest.
We're going to have a very special guest on next episode, which is one of my selections. We're going to cover They Live with Kevin Cole, one of the owners of Cap City Video Lounge.
Talked about often on the pod.
Yes, we've referenced it. And this will come out after this, so I'm going to say this knowing that you're going to hear this and be like, this has already happened. But this Friday,
yes,
They Live is going to be screened at Cap City Video Lounge. I will be there taking some notes and getting ready in 2 weeks to talk about They Live. So,
hell yeah.
You know, like, subscribe, listen, tell us what's up, be kind, smash the police state, don't engage in imperial wars, Ben lovingly embrace military veterans who are ready to relinquish the bullshit and embrace the program.
Hell yeah, I love it. And kill
the poor.
Kill the poor.
Kill